Without a second-round pick, thanks to the Leonard Williams trade, everyone's expecting the Seahawks to trade down. But could there be a player or two that would make it irresistible for John Schneider to stick at number 16 overall? I'm going to be breaking it all down in our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks, as always, to all the 12s tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Whether you're in Bowling Green, Kentucky, or Augsburg, Germany, we greatly appreciate each and every one of you. And on the NFL draft, going to be diving into a few players who I believe John Schneider would have a hard time passing up at number 16 overall, even with the desire to trade down. I'll be tackling your mailbag questions since we didn't get to them on Monday. We're going to have a Thursday mailbag, and we're going to cap off the show ranking Seattle's defensive position groups heading towards this month's draft. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Over the years, John Schneider has rightfully earned a reputation for being one of the shrewdest wheelers and dealers during the NFL draft. Over 35 trades conducted since he took over as general manager in 2010. The majority of those being trade downs. There's certainly been some trade ups that have been successful for the Seahawks as well. But they have made a habit over the years of moving down and recouping picks. And it feels like this year that it's inevitable because the Seahawks don't have a second-round pick and they have such a large gap between their first-round pick and the 81st selection in the third round. It just seems inevitable that John Schneider is going to trade down. There's all kinds of rumors out there that are swirling about teams such as the Bills, who just traded Stephon Diggs. They need a receiver. The Chiefs certainly could use some receivers to try to restore that passing game a little bit. Even though they won a Super Bowl, it wasn't necessarily an offense that was as explosive as the pass in the passing game. And even teams like the Dallas Cowboys could be looking to move up at least 6 spots, 7 spots or more with the Seahawks in that prime position. With that being said, I think John Schneider's got a few players on his big board. He's going to be exploring all these trade avenues. But if a few certain players fall to the Seahawks at number 16, I do think that he's going to have a hard time trading down. And it's comparing apples to oranges when you look at last year's number 5 overall pick versus this year's number 16 overall pick. Last year, the Seahawks could have traded down if they wanted to, but with that 5th pick, they were afforded the flexibility where they were guaranteed they were going to get one of the blue chip players because how early they were picking with that pick they got from the Denver Broncos. This year, you've got 15 teams in front of you. That's 15 teams that could trade back with other teams. The Seahawks don't have the draft capital to really move up themselves. And I don't think that's something they're going to be overly interested in doing. The chances of getting a blue chipper at that spot is much lower. Not impossible, but it's much lower than you would say with the number 5 pick when they were able to get Devin Witherspoon last year, who was a home run selection, made the Pro Bowl, a finalist for Rookie of the Year. John Schneider's not going to be in quite the same position this year, and yet I do see a few names that jump out to me. If you're looking at the positions that would really stand out that might make John Schneider sit put at number 16, first and foremost, offensive line, players that can play the guard position, and that can be college tackles. There are players out there like Troy Fautanu from Washington who played for Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff, who are now on the Seahawks staff. Obviously, if he's there at number 16, that is going to be very enticing for John Schneider and the coaching staff. Those guys are going to be pounding their fist to the table saying, hey, let's sit put. Let's take this guy. We can slide him inside to guard. He's got a chance to be a Pro Bowl caliber guard early on in his career. The same could be same for Talisa Fuaga from Oregon State, 6'6", 330 plus pounds, 33 and an 1/8-inch arms, didn't give up a single sack in his college career. If Fuaga or Fautanu are there at number 16, then I think John Schneider is going to have a tougher time wanting to move down because you are looking at blue chip offensive line prospects that have tackle flexibility, but could also be starters at guard immediately for the Seahawks. And both of them have very high ceilings. They're already very polished coming into the league. Fatanu had a fantastic year last year. Fuaga didn't give up a sack his entire college career. He's probably going to play inside of the next level, though, because edge rushers might give him a little bit of trouble at the tackle position in the NFL. That said, both these guys playing inside, I think, would be fantastic. So those are two players that jump out. If somehow J.J. McCarthy was to fall down to 16, I think the chances of that happening are probably below aliens landing on the planet tonight. I just don't think there's any chance that there's going to be J.J. McCarthy there at number 16. I would think there's a better chance that he's gone in the first 3 picks than falling out of the top 10. But if there was that 1 in a billion moment where J.J. McCarthy is there at 16, John Schneider has already shown a lot of interest in him. If that was to be a player that was there, I think he'd have a very hard time passing up on that, even with trading recently for Sam Howell. As far as other players that jump out to me that could be worthy or could justify staying at that number 16 spot, Dallas Turner, the edge rusher from Alabama. Edge rusher, as I'll talk about later in the show, is not the biggest need for the Seahawks short term on defense. But this is a best player available instance here. Dallas Turner is a nightmare off the edge. He's a sound run defender for being under 250 pounds. And he really fits that mold of that versatile edge that can drop back, can rush the passer, that would fit into Mike Macdonald's system. So I think Dallas Turner would make a lot of sense. Jarrett Verse is a little different style player off the edge, a bigger body guy that can win more with power as a pass rusher, a really solid run defender as well. I think both those players would make a lot of sense. And Jer'Zhan Newton also goes by Johnny Newton. Some of you that follow me on social media might have seen some of the clips I put up to net today. You want to talk about a player that is an absolute nightmare to block. Newton is not the biggest of guys, 280, 285 pounds. So he's a smaller defensive tackle, and yet this guy plays with a relentless motor. He has an elite first step off the snap. His ability to threaten edges with guards and tackles as well. He slid out sometimes at big end at Illinois and found success, but particularly that guard spot when he's playing 3-tech or 4-eye, he is a handful for opposing guards to try to keep out of the backfield, frequently harassing quarterbacks. He's a above average run defender as well. I think Newton is probably going to be gone in the first 20 picks, but if he's there at 16, that might be a guy, even with the move Seattle has made, re-signing Leonard Williams. You still got Jaron Reed, 1 year left of his contract, Draymond Jones. That still might be a case, best player available. The Seahawks already met with him at the Combine. They may have had other visits with him as well. He is certainly a player that would fit Mike Macdonald's defense. I think he fits any defense, quite frankly. He is an absolutely fantastic player. And as far as who my Devin Witherspoon is this year, those of you that listened to the show last season, there were plenty of people that scoffed at the idea, especially with Reek Woolen coming off a Defensive Rookie of the Year finalist season, scoffed at the idea that the Seahawks would draft a corner with their 5th overall pick. But the more that I watched Devin Witherspoon, it just became apparent to me, this is clearly a Pete Carroll-style player. I thought he looked like a can't-miss prospect, had a really strong rookie season. So I was not surprised when Seattle invested their 5th overall pick in him. The player that I would not be surprised if Seattle picked at number 16 that would floor most people, it would have their jaws dropping to the floor. It's another secondary player, and that is Cooper DeJean. We've talked about him a lot, the corner/safety from Iowa. I think he is a safety in the NFL. Watching his corner tape, I don't know necessarily that he has the change of direction skills to be an outside corner and be quite as good at safety. I think this guy would be an absolute monster. 2 years ago, he only missed 3 tackles the entire season for Iowa. He had 5 interceptions, and 3 of them he returned for touchdowns. This guy is a dynamic playmaker. You could plug him in as a punt returner right away. But I just look at his skill set, being a really good tackler, an aggressive downhill player that has great ball skills. I think he could play in the box. He could play back as a free safety. You could play him in the slot with ease, and he could play outside if you needed him to. I just look at him being a guy with what Kyle Hamilton was able to do. Not the same players per se, but very versatile players that have that playmaking ability to create turnovers and wreak havoc. Cooper DeJean is that player that I've highlighted. The more film that I'm watching, thinking that's got to be a guy that Mike Macdonald's drooling over. And you look at that safety position, Rayshon Jenkins is on a 2-year deal that could become a 1-year deal. He's 30-plus years old. Who knows what his status is beyond this year? Julian Love's a free agent after this year. Kayvon Wallace is a free agent after this year. Jarek Reed's coming off a torn ACL. There are question marks at that safety spot beyond this year. If you were able to get a guy like Cooper DeJean that could come in and be a starter right away over some of these veterans that you paid peanuts to, then I think that is a win-win for the Seahawks. And with this system being so based off of trying to disguise and move guys around, Cooper DeJean would be an incredible weapon. So I would not rule out, even at number 16, if John Schneider looks at that pick and Mike McDonald looks at that pick and says, I want to get a guy that I think can be an all-pro caliber safety that's a dynamic playmaker, get me Cooper DeJean. So I'm not quite as confident on it as I was with Devin Witherspoon last year. If that is a guy that I absolutely could see the Seahawks picking at number 16, then I think Seahawks fans should at least pay close attention to here leading up to the draft in 3 weeks. Coming up next, I'm going to tackle your mailbag questions here. Didn't get them on Monday, so I'm going to answer as many as I can here on our Thursday episode of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost at every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, the end of this month, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right. No cap on 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most out of your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. And you must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. As always, a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. If you're tired of turning on Fox Sports or ESPN and having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, make the switch today to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's time for our weekly mailbag segment. Normally we do this on Monday, but with draft season in full heat, and when we've got the mock drafts coming out left and right, there's been a lot of stuff for us to cover, so we had to move the mailbag to our Thursday episode. With that being said, tons of awesome questions from you, our valued listeners. Let's get to them. Our first one coming from Catman Did on X. Been a lot of ins, a lot of outs, and a lot of what have yous in free agent season. What is your general sense as to how this roster stacks up in terms of raw talent to the pre-draft roster same time last year? Are there reasons for optimism? So answering the last part of that question, as far as reasons for optimism, of course there are. This is still a team that has a lot of really good young players. Devin Witherspoon, Reek Woolen. I'm still very excited about what Mike Morris is going to do, especially being reunited with his former defensive coordinator at Michigan, now new head coach Mike McDonald. You look on the offensive side of the football, DK Metcalf, Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba has an incredibly high ceiling. I think Noah Fant in this offense has a chance to be much more productive. You've got two young tackles that I'm still very high on, two really good young running backs. And now you brought in Sam Howell to compete, at least, compete at some point with Geno Smith. But you've got a good young quarterback that you now have as the backup to Geno Smith that could be your future. Maybe he's not, but you took that swing. I see a lot of good young pieces, and I like some of the free agency moves they made. I think Rayshon Jenkins is a good short-term fit in this secondary to go with Julian Love. Kayvon Wallace is that third safety, can do some fun things moving around. The only area that I still have concerns about, and this is why I don't see, at least right now, going to the draft, I think that this team, because of the state of the offensive line, away from the tackle positions, That is my biggest concern right now. That's why I'm hesitant to say that this roster is in a better spot than it was this time last year, because there have been defections at linebacker. Bobby Wagner's gone. Jordan Brooks is gone. And that offensive line, you've got one player at both guard spots and center that's got more than one NFL start under his belt. So this is a very raw, young group in the middle, inexperienced. And the one signing they have made so far, Tremaine Ancrum, he's got one start in his NFL career. So I'm hesitant to say this roster is better than it was last year at this point, but I have more optimism. That may sound like two things that go against each other, but I like the young core they have. And going into this draft, you still got a chance to really address those positions in the middle of your line, add some more playmakers on defense. And I think that this could be a roster coming out of the draft that looks better than it did a year ago. But I think that this is an important draft, and there's still some free agents that the Seahawks are looking at as well. Our next question, and this one's coming from J. Cole 206. I just watched an hour-long cut-up of McDonald's scheme in Baltimore, and it highlighted player versatility. Are there any off-ball linebackers in the draft who you think could drop back in Tampa coverage or even carry vertical seam down? Those of you watching on YouTube, the first name I'm going to throw out is pictured there. Junior Colson, who played for Mike Macdonald as a true freshman in 2021. He ended up earning a starting job on Michigan's defense as a true freshman. This guy had a really strong final season in Ann Arbor in coverage. He's improved a lot since that first year that he started for Mike Macdonald in 2021, was one of the higher graded coverage linebackers on Pro Football Focus. I like his ability to be able to carry the seam. I think he can drop back in those Tampa 2 looks. He's got the athleticism and still has enough size at 240 plus pounds that he can get downhill and thump people in the run game. He might be my favorite linebacker in this entire class. As far as a few other names worth watching that I think have the physical tools, the athletic tools to be able to handle those coverage duties, Peyton Wilson from North Carolina State. I have some big concerns with him in terms of his durability. He's had a lot of injuries. His run defense has been good for the most part, but there are some missed tackles out there. But he's a fluid athlete when he's healthy. You can send him back on a number of different coverage assignments. He can handle those Tampa 2 assignments. He can carry routes down the seam, and he's got enough burst to be able to do that. So I like him in that capacity. And a few other names that I have on my short list here. Edgerrin Cooper from Texas A&M. I don't know that he's necessarily the right scheme fit as a smaller inside linebacker to play in this scheme, but he is a really smooth athlete with quality coverage skills. And then Jalen Ford from Texas. He's not getting a lot of buzz right now. A lot of people listing him as a day 3 selection, but he's got good numbers. He played a lot of snaps at Texas. Another guy with really good athleticism that I think can handle those coverage duties in Mike Macdonald's defense. I think he would make a lot of sense. And my wild card here, he's a player that I'm very high on that's getting a lot of late day 3 buzz because of where he played. But Jordan McGee is a damn good football player coming from Temple. He's a little bit thin, under 230 pounds, but he plays bigger than that. He's a really good run defender. He'll come up and hit you. He has good blitzing production rushing the passer, and he's also a stellar coverage linebacker that has a lot of athleticism. He's a very twitchy player that I think Mike Macdonald would have a lot of fun with developing him. Maybe not ready to start early, but a guy that could eventually be a starter for you in the league. And I think he'd be a good fit for this scheme. So those are just 5 names that jump out to me, top of my list, as far as off-ball coverage linebackers that would fit this scheme in this class. Our next question coming from Big Meech 247. Is it safe to assume the Seahawks will still follow the same roster building strategy with a whole new staff minus John Schneider? So John Schneider was actually asked about this at the NFL League meetings when reporters met with him last week. And this was kind of a yes and no response. Yes, in the sense that I'm still in charge. We're still going to handle the things with the draft in the same way that we always have. I think there's still going to be a priority for certain position groups that we've seen from John Schneider over the years. But where the no comes into play is this whole brand new coaching staff and getting to know what kind of players that they are looking for. It is not going to be a carbon copy with what Pete Carroll and his staff wanted. For example, I think even though Pete Carroll valued versatility, I think Mike Macdonald, the free agency moves clearly show that he's on a different level valuing multiplicity from his players on defense in particular. And I think on the offensive side of the ball, you're going to see differences in the type of players that they're going to be looking for in the trenches. They're really going to covet those athletes that they can move as pullers and in the zone scheme and being able to get to the second level and still having physicality. And I think from a receiver and tight end standpoint, there may be some slight differences in Ryan Grubb's systems. So that's really what this is going to boil down to, the personnel that these coaches are going to want blending with the roster building strategies. John Schneider is still not wanting to invest in the guard position. Maybe we see that play out in the draft, not using early picks on that position. But these coaches may have a say on that too. That'll be a little different than the previous staff. So I see this being something, it's not going to be completely the same. There will be some differences, but John Schneider is still John Schneider. So you're going to see a lot of the same roster building strategies moving forward. Our next question here coming from Ryan B. Katz. Seems like biggest priority on both sides of the ball this offseason has been Swiss Army knife guys who maybe aren't elite but can do multiple jobs well. Do you think this reflects the chasing edges approach where schematics can be harder to diagnose? That's exactly what this is, the diagnosis part. It's so much easier to be able to do those pre-snap disguises when you have 2 or 3 safeties that are interchangeable and they can play in the nickel. They can play split safety. They can play single high. They can play down in the box. And that's what the Seahawks have given themselves in the safety group. And they've got some corners that can play outside and inside. And it makes it a lot easier for you to show man coverage and then turn around and run Tampa 2. And that was something that the Baltimore Ravens were as good as any team in the NFL at doing with Mike Macdonald as defensive coordinator. So particularly on the defensive side of the football, yes, that multiplicity, the positional flexibility is crucial to being able to disguise the way that Mike Macdonald wants to as a defensive-minded coach. DPanky827, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you the Seahawks will receive a strong trade offer to trade back? Do you agree with Field Yates? There will be multiple playoff teams that will want to move up. These situations are always fluid because we don't know how those first 15 picks ahead of the Seahawks are going to play out. But if there's a run on quarterbacks and offensive players, skill players, there's a lot of good receivers in this draft class. If there's a run on a couple of those position groups early, you could see some defensive players and offensive linemen that normally are in the top 10 mix that are there at number 16. You could see some good receivers there that are going to be in the mix as well. And a lot of those teams at the back of the first round have lost tackles and or receivers. And so they're going to be looking to try to add talent there. So if I had to give a percent chance that those teams are going to be giving aggressive offers to trade up, at least one of them, I'm going to say 85%. I think there's a very strong possibility with the way this draft class is set up, how I anticipate that those first 15 picks are going to go, at least the position groups, they're going to fly off the board. And if you have a QB that is there in the middle that somebody wants, like a Michael Penix, maybe that leads to a trade up too. I could see there being multiple teams competing, which would be really good for John Schneider and company because you could have a little bit of a mini bidding war to see if you can get an extra pick or a higher pick than maybe you would originally if you just had one team wanting to trade up. So I'm going to go with 85% chance that there's going to be a deal that works out in the back half of the first round, at least in the sense that teams are going to be reaching out. We'll see what John Schneider is able to do if he's aiming to recoup draft picks. Our last question here, coming from Nolan Waters 5, what do you envision the offense looking like this coming season, and how do you think it will differ from the last few under Pete and, of course, Shane Waldron is the OC? So as far as similarities, I think that you're still going to see a lot of deep shots downfield. If you watch the Washington Huskies the last couple of years, they let Michael Penix let it rip downfield to his stud receivers. The Seahawks have a very good deep passer in Geno Smith. They have one of the best receiving corps in the NFL. So I don't see that aspect changing. What I do see changing, the tight end personnel groups. I would not expect to see near as many multiple tight end looks. There's going to be more 4 wide receiver sets. And I expect the run game, there's going to be some variability there. That's maybe the biggest question mark for me. Are we going to see more gap like we saw last season from Washington, or is it going to go back to being zone heavy, which was most of Ryan Grubb's time as an offensive coordinator at the college level? That's kind of the big question mark that personnel decisions in the draft may give us some insight on. But as far as big differences, I think the personnel groupings is going to be the most notable. The biggest similarity, I would expect that you're going to see plenty of those shots downfield because the personnel is well suited to be able to do it. Coming up next, I'm going to be ranking Seattle's defensive position groups heading into the draft. Where are they the strongest, and which group do they have the biggest question marks, both short and long term? I'll get to those here in a moment on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to start ripping your hair out when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. And Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. If you want to see the Seattle Kraken at Climate Pledge Arena before the season closes out, thanks to Game Time's awesome flash deals feature and a detailed stadium map, you can get tickets at the Pledge for under $100, and it's super easy. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and with the Game Time guarantee, if you find tickets in the same section or row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This episode's also brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, it's what brings the winning trophy home, and it also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors, they've got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're going to be burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks, as always, to all the 12s tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Last week, I broke down the offensive position groups for the Seahawks heading into the draft. And obviously, there's been one signing since then. I don't think Laviska Shenault joining the team changes those rankings at all. Receiver was number one. You just added a little more depth. But today, I'm going to switch gears looking at where things stand on defense. Now, on offense, you've got 6 position groups because the offensive line can break up a little bit more. On the defensive side of things, we've got 5 position groups heading into the draft. And I don't see a position group that jumps out like guard does on offense that clearly is the biggest issue on defense. It feels like there's a lot of positions where there are questions, but there could be reasons for optimism as well. So jump-starting the rankings as far as where the Seahawks stand position-wise heading into this season, I got to start off with number 1 in my rankings here on defense. It's got to be the cornerback spot because you've got the 2 alpha dogs atop the depth chart. Riq Woolen still had good coverage numbers last year. If you can get the tackling back to where it needs to be and create a few more interception opportunities, I think he has a chance to really bounce back this year. And Devin Witherspoon, he has just scratched the surface of his potential. You've got a starter caliber number 3 and number 4 in Mike Jackson and Trey Brown. I still think Kobe Bryant's got some upside as one of those Swiss Army knife kind of players that you can play at multiple spots. So the cornerback position easily takes the cake for me as the most talented position on this team. And I think with a defensive-minded staff of different mindset under Mike Macdonald and bringing back Carl Scott, you are going to have some continuity there. But I think this group, there's a chance they could really play to their potential this year in this scheme. So I think this is clearly the most talented. And I'm going to go the interior defensive line for number 2. You re-sign Leonard Williams. You've got him for the next 3 seasons. He had a really strong 10 games after coming over from the Giants last year. Jaron Reed had a revival season at 31, still playing at a high level. You can move him up and down the line. Draymond Jones is the big wild card here because he had a very inconsistent season at best last year, his first year in Seattle. But I'm wondering if maybe he can be a Justin Matabuke type in Mike Macdonald's scheme where they're going to find better ways to get him into ideal situations where he can rush the passer. I'm excited to see what Seattle can do. Clearly, they're excited to see what he can do with this new coaching staff, with them not trying to move him and picking up his bonus earlier this offseason. I just think you add those guys in, the fact that Jonathan Hankins gives you a true nose tackle that has a history with Adam Durde, your defensive coordinator. I love Miles Adams and Mike Morris in reserve roles, Cameron Young as well. I think this group is talented. It has a good mix of veterans and young players. And I think that you've got a lot of guys that really fit this defensive scheme well. So defensive line comes in at number 2 for me in the rankings. At number 3, this is where things got sticky. These next 3 position groups, I think you could make arguments for them to be in any order. But for me, I'm going to go with edge just because I believe Uchenna Nwosu, we saw just how important he is to this football team last year when he got injured in week 6 and suffered that pectoral injury, missed the rest of the season. Seattle badly missed him. You're going to get him back fully healthy this year. Boye Mafe still hasn't reached his potential, his full potential, and almost hit double-digit sacks last year. I still think there's a lot of room for him to grow, which is scary considering how well he played last year. Kind of tuckered out a little bit late in the season, but now that he's been a starter for a full year, I think that he's a good fit in this scheme. What I'm intrigued by are the last 2 guys in the depth chart. Darrell Taylor, they're giving him one last chance. If Mike McDonald's staff cannot unleash his full potential, then it is truly time to move on. They've given themselves the leeway to do that with minimum guarantees, but everybody knows the athleticism and the pass rushing ability is there. If you could just make him a competent run defender and find more consistency rushing the passer, he could break out in this scheme. And Derek Hall as well, second-year player, did chances rush the there were flashes of the run defender. I'm excited to see where he fits in as well. You've got Levi Bell coming back, and I think he could potentially make some noise to make this football team. So edge comes in at number 3 for me, mainly because of the top 2 guys. I like the 1-2 punch of Uchenna Nwosu and Boye Mafe. Coming in number 4, safety has some uncertainty, even though you've got some veterans here. Julian Love was a Pro Bowler last year and played really well in the second half. His first half was not great. I want to see what version of Julian Love that comes out in this scheme. And then you've got Rayshon Jenkins, who has been a really good but not great player. How much does he elevate your defense without Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams? And Kayvon Wallace has primarily been a sub-package player to this point. You don't know where Jarek Reed's health stands. He might not be ready for the start of the season. So that's one of the reasons I could see a safety getting drafted early. There are question marks, not just this year, but certainly in the future with 2 of those 3 veteran safeties being free agents next year. And Rayshon Jenkins, it could be a 1-year deal that doesn't turn into 2 as it is scheduled. So there are questions there. So I'm going with that group at number 4. Coming in at last for me, and this is different than the guard position. I have reasons for optimism with the linebacker spot. I think Tyrell Dodson, a 25-year-old, very athletic linebacker that put up good numbers in the second half of the Bills last year. There's a lot to like about this kid, but we haven't had a large enough sample size to know, is he going to be a long-term starter for you in this scheme, particularly playing the Mike spot? Coverage has some hit and miss views on film as well. Got to see a larger sample size to see where he really fits in. And I think Jerome Baker is kind of in that Rayshon Jenkins class where he has had seasons where he's been very good, but he's never been great or elite. He is a solid starter, and that's what the Seahawks are looking for right now. He's a good fit athleticism-wise. He's been a really sound coverage linebacker. So I think for this year, at least, that this is going to be a nice mix of linebackers. And at the same time, I'd love to see him bring in somebody like a Junior Colson or a Peyton Wilson, one of these linebackers that I think is going to go on day 2. Bring him in and let him compete right away with these 2 free agents. That they beat him out, that's awesome. If they don't, hey, it's fine. You sign these guys in free agency because you believed in them. They can still be impact starters. So I just think there's enough questions with both those guys being on 1-year deals too. You have to be looking towards 2025 and beyond as well. So I'd be stunned if they don't pick a linebacker fairly early in this draft class, because that's still a position where long-term questions need to be addressed. So again, those last 3 spots, edge, linebacker, safety, I think you could mix and match them in any order depending on what your parameters are. I think there's some optimism at all those spots, but I can also see some concerns, particularly beyond this season and heading towards this draft, where you may want to address 2, if not all 3 of those position groups with the draft picks that you have at your disposal. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow on our Blue Friday episode, I'll be joined by Nick Lee. We'll be diving into some of those trade down possibilities in the back part of the first round, and we'll be capping off our Seahawks alumni March Madness tournament. Which alumni team takes home the championship? We'll be breaking it all down. Make sure you're listening in, and thanks for tuning in today's episode. Go Hawks.